Alrighty, hi everybody. We were going to do our meeting in August, but unfortunately scheduling didn't work out. So welcome to our third meeting now. Today we're going to be talking tobacco and nicotine products and really just focusing on, what the harms are and essentially how you can mitigate those harms. And if you or someone you know is addicted to nicotine products, essentially how you can, try and get off of that if that's something you're interested in. So can everybody here, not here, can everybody see the presentation? Someone just like unmute or say something.
We can't see it. Or at least I can.
Oh, splendid. How wonderful. That's why. Recording and screen sharing. They're different buttons. I should remember that. Okie dokie. Wonderful. Well, here we are. And yeah, let's just jump straight in. So we're students for well-balanced effective education on drugs, and today we're going to be talking tobacco and nicotine, as I just mentioned. So what exactly is nicotine? Well, nicotine is a mildly psychoactive stimulant that's often extracted from the tobacco plant or produced synthetically. It can be extracted from other plants that are in similar families or genuses, such as tomato plants, for example, have small amounts of nicotine in them, but the most common source is either tobacco or synthetic production. And what essentially mildly psychoactive stimulant means is it does produce some very mild psychological changes, and it does affect your brain chemistry, which we'll get to in a little bit. And it also acts as a stimulant. Essentially, it's a pick-me-up. It gives you a boost of energy, so to speak, similar to that of caffeine. It causes the brain to produce adrenaline and dopamine, which have a range of effects on users that we'll get into in a little bit. But a lot of this has to do with, raising your heart rate, making you seem more alert and energetic and focused. And it's often been used as a traditional medicine, insecticide, and stimulant drug. So people consume it recreationally, but they also consume it medicinally. And we found that it's, in to varying amounts, it's a poison. And so we've used that throughout history to actually kill different insects. And one thing to note, which I'm sure many of us are already aware of, is that nicotine is a highly addictive drug. Some people have compared its addiction levels to that of cocaine or heroin, which we typically associate as being very scary, hard drugs. So some commonly used nicotine products include cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. So these are probably the things that most people are familiar with when they think of nicotine. But other examples include e-cigarettes, whether that's a Juul, a Puff Bar, or other similar e-cigarette models. There's hookahs, which are essentially a bowl of water, and then you have nicotine products, or you have tobacco inside that, and you inhale it as a vapor from generally a larger apparatus. There's chewing tobacco or snuff, which, as the name suggests, can be either put in your mouth or snorted or puffed. There are nicotine pouches, which you can put in your mouth and dissolve. Common brands include that, like Zyn. And then there are some nicotine cessation medicines. So nicotine patches and nicotine gum are both created as alternative ways for you to essentially get nicotine into your body a bit more safely. Obviously, it's never 100% safe, and it's not something that any of us would ever endorse or recommend that you start using if you don't currently use nicotine, but nicotine patches and nicotine gum are significantly safer than other forms of, nicotine ingestion, for example, cigarettes, cigars, or e-cigarettes. And Salem, do you want to cover the short-term effects of nicotine? Alrighty, their screen appears to be frozen, so I'm just going to take it from here. If they come back, that's awesome. But some of the short-term effects on nicotine, nicotine essentially mimics a lot of other chemicals that have impacts on your brain. So some physical impacts include increased blood pressure and increased heart rate. This is because whether it's inhaling or chewing or snuffing nicotine, it causes your blood vessels to constrict, which increases your blood pressure, right? At this point, the amount of blood and the rate at which blood is moving through your body has remained the same, but the areas through which they're moving are significantly thinner, which increases or raises your blood pressure. Increased heart rate, this is because releases chemicals such as adrenaline, which cause your heart rate to increase, cause your rate of breathing to increase, because essentially your body is thinking you're in a fight or flight mode. Obviously, this isn't like a lethal amount of adrenaline, but it does cause you to kind of have that boost of energy and kind of boost of awareness or alertness. It can lead to a head rush for people who are new to using nicotine or don't use it very often. It can kind of lead to a feeling of dizziness or a feeling of like, ooh, wow, there's a bit of a rush going on in my head. Nausea, this doesn't generally happen, but it can be a sign of nicotine poisoning. If you ingest far too much nicotine, which most people generally don't, it can cause your body to become nauseous because at this point, your body's like, I have ingested a certain amount of poison and I want to get rid of it in some way. And typically that's through vomiting. And finally, it can lead to a reduced sense of taste and smell. This is because, as the most common nicotine products are that like chewing tobacco, e-cigarettes, and cigarettes, Ultimately, what this does is it wears down and damages the organs in your mouth and your nose that lead to you being able to taste and smell everything at 100% effectiveness. So over time, you have a reduced sense of taste and smell. Some of the psychological components, oftentimes, which are the result of the release of the chemical dopamine in your brain, can be a feeling of relaxation, a content mood, reduced stress and anxiety, or increased alertness. So ultimately, when dopamine is released, a lot of scientists often refer to dopamine as the feel-good chemical. This basically causes you to, feel good. It makes your mood better, and it puts you in essentially a state of mind where, things are a bit more pleasant. Now, for the long-term effects of nicotine, this very much depends on what method of ingestion you're using. So obviously, if you're smoking a cigarette or a pipe, that's incredibly different from chewing tobacco. But one of the most common effects of nicotine or tobacco usage is that it can cause a predisposition to lung problems. This is because the most common method of ingestion is smoking or e-cigarette usage. So what this can lead to is problems like bronchitis or other issues, just because over time your lungs aren't able to fully clear themselves, and you can end up with a buildup of mucus in your lungs or your esophageal cavity. But in addition to that, you can have a predisposition to cancers of your lung, heart, mouth, esophagus, or really any other bodily system that's involved with the ingestion of nicotine. And this is because at the end of the day, tobacco is carcinogenic, which essentially means that it causes cancer, right? It causes the areas that are exposed to it over time to essentially break down, and it causes those cells to not really be functioning at full effectiveness, right? So if you continuously use nicotine products, you're increasing the likelihood that wherever you're using it or in whichever way you're using it, that area can develop cancer. Now, the psychological impacts of nicotine over the long term are very dependent on who you are and essentially how often you use it. Teenagers are much more likely to have some of the later negative effects that I'll get into in just a bit. But one of the first things that can happen is an increased association of nicotine with feeling good. And so this is because your brain basically creates a positive association or a positive feedback loop. It knows that when you take nicotine, dopamine is released in your brain and you feel better. And so over time, your brain essentially figures out, hey, when I do this, I feel good. And over time, it makes you want to do it more and more. And this is why nicotine can be so addictive, because it's a relatively easy way to increase your brain's level of dopamine. And therefore, your brain and body just say, hey, that's nice. But in addition to that, these are problems that are more likely to occur if you use it early on or if you use it as a teenager or as a child, but it can lead to increased cognitive decline or a loss in brain volume. Both of these can happen because at the end of the day, nicotine, again, fundamentally alters your brain chemistry. And as chemicals like dopamine and adrenaline and various other chemicals that are released because of nicotine or as a byproduct of it, your brain's chemistry ultimately changes over time. And essentially what this means is you're not able to develop the same like neural growth that you would be otherwise. So your brain is built on the idea of like, I build connections, I learn about the world, and I figure out things that are enjoyable to me, right? Because as human beings or as animals, our predisposition is to go for things that make us feel positive because we want to, feel good. That's a natural thing. However, when we build up a positive association with something as often and as repeated as nicotine usage, what ends up happening is your brain isn't really able to find those other pathways, so to speak. But in addition to that, just that increased use of dopamine over time leads to your brain having a higher like baseline or a higher threshold for dopamine. So if you constantly use nicotine products, then when you deprive yourself of them, your brain and body stop feeling good. Suddenly everything feels a little less nice than the average or the baseline compared to what it usually is otherwise. In addition to that, it can lead to a predisposition to dementia. For example, if you use nicotine products or tobacco products repeatedly, there's a higher risk of you developing dementia, either as an early onset syndrome or even later on in your life. Salem, I noticed you're back. Would you like to cover smoking versus vaping?
Yeah, totally. So smoking versus vaping, there's not a huge difference in terms of the psychological effects. It's more just the composition of the actual nicotine product that you're using. So there's tobacco leaves in cigarettes and cigars. In cigarettes, they're more finely ground than in cigars. Also, there's a way higher nicotine content in cigars and cigarettes. Cigars are between 100 and 200 milligrams, while cigarettes are only 10 or 12 milligrams. Still, that is much more than the nicotine content, which you can see is usually 0.5 to 14.5 milligrams per 15 puffs. Also, most nicotine products like e-cigarettes are flavored with juice made of a tobacco extract, along with lots of chemicals added to create an aerosol type of effect.
Definitely. And real quick, just to add on to that, a lot of people don't really know how e-cigarettes work. So just kind of what exactly e-cigarette liquid is made out of, or vape juice, as people often call it. It's generally made out of vegetable propyl or vegetable glycerin, which are essentially the like means for distributing that nicotine to your body. And a lot of nicotine products, for example, Juuls or refillable products like Novos or Nords, are oftentimes use nicotine salts, which essentially extract the chemical nicotine from the actual tobacco plant so you can concentrate it significantly more. So certain flavorings, use various flavors that we see in our food products that we eat in day-to-day life. One flavoring, however, is incredibly dangerous and has actually been linked to popcorn lung. So that's diacetyl. Diacetyl was originally used to flavor buttered popcorn, but has since been used just as an artificial sweetener and as a flavoring. And so a lot of people have associated just vaping in general with popcorn lung. And obviously vaping isn't good. Once again, we're not saying you should start vaping. However, it's important to know really what's in your vape juice. If it has diacetyl, it's much more dangerous than if it doesn't have it. So just kind of being aware of that. And nicotine safety, Bennett, would you like to cover this?
Yeah. So in this club, obviously, what we do isn't just telling you, like, there are these risks, and so don't do the drug, because that is a helpful way of talking about drugs in a limited sense, but that shouldn't be the only way we talk about drugs. So we have to address nicotine safety, basically, what kind of rules you should give yourself if you are a nicotine user and you are interested in reducing the risks that you have, because an addiction isn't just something that you can kick, um, like based on one presentation. So nicotine safety, smoking, so smoking cigars, smoking cigarettes, that represents like more than 90% of the short and long-term health risks of nicotine addiction. On an earlier slide, we talked about like the different kind of categories of the effects between like physical effects and psychological effects. And in terms of like the health risks to you developing cancer, you dying, the physical effects, they get a lot more heightened when you're using smoking, when you're using cigars and cigarettes. So just avoiding smoking, and you can see this chart by the side where it gives you a lot of like different ways people use nicotine. Just avoiding smoking is probably the biggest step you could make towards um, having a more healthy nicotine addiction. Not really a healthy nicotine addiction, but like a less risky nicotine addiction. Um, so yeah, these other products, basically all of them are safer. If you can, it would also help to avoid tobacco, and because even though, as we've kind of addressed, vaping and these other media of nicotine delivery, they do have their own set of risks. But again, the kind of combination of tobacco, which creates tar and a lot of carcinogenic substances on its own, and burning tobacco, that constitutes the vast majority of the risk. And then a second point that you can remember is that developing brains, and we all have developing brains because we're high schoolers. So developing brains are much more susceptible to addiction. And what I mean by developing brains is like childhood through to about when your brain will stop developing. So in maybe like 5 years, 5 to 10 years. So yeah, deciding to try nicotine later, basically when your brain is not as vulnerable to its entire structure and its entire chemistry being altered by the addiction, you become less vulnerable as you age and as you go out of puberty. So just the basic choice of saying, like, if I am going to try it, I'm going to wait until I'm older, or just saying like the risks are too high now. So even if you're interested, even if your friends are like pushing it onto you, the you can try to avoid it until later in your life if you think that it's some kind of necessity to you. And then just always remembering that moderation and awareness in terms of habits that you can have are the most important in order to prevent this from becoming, to prevent this from being a habit that you have, and to prevent that from developing into a dependency and addiction. And that's when you see like the vast majority of um, the nicotine use in terms of building up like um, what's the word? Building up the thing.
Tolerance.
Yes, tolerance. Sorry. When you're building up tolerance, when you're building up that dependency on nicotine, that's when you're going to see these like this exponential growth of the risks and of the harm to your body and your mind. So just controlling, or at least being mindful of your amount of dependency on nicotine and on basically any drug is a very key principle.
Definitely. Thank you, Bennett. One thing I just wanted to point out real quick, if you remember the previous slide, Salem talked about the nicotine concentration in various forms of delivery, cigars, cigarettes, and e-cigarettes or vaping. What you'll notice is they're slightly different from the contents listed on this chart here. That's because this chart is essentially listing how much of that nicotine on average is absorbed into your bloodstream and absorbed into your brain. This is because, when you smoke a cigarette, for example, you don't inhale 100% of the burnt material that's in the cigarette. You don't inhale 100% of the smoke because some of it burns away, some of it you exhale. And so not all of the nicotine from any one of these products, not 100% of it is making it into your bloodstream. So that's just to kind of clarify that difference right there. So signs and symptoms of nicotine addiction. So, up until this point, if you don't use nicotine products, hopefully you are aware of the fact that you probably shouldn't. If you are, then, not smoking is the best choice that you can make. But if you're already using nicotine products, or if you're worried that you or someone you know is addicted to nicotine, then it's important to kind of recognize, what exactly those signs and symptoms are. So if you find it difficult to stop using nicotine products, right? If for example, you use an e-cigarette and it's incredibly hard for you to just put it down and not use it for a few days or a couple weeks at a time, or you've tried unsuccessfully to do so, you've told yourself or others, I'm going to stop on this day, or I'm going to stop starting this week, and you were unable to do that, then that's a very clear indicator that you may very well be addicted to nicotine. In addition, if you develop mental health or physical problems, then that's a very clear sign. For example, if you notice that your physical performance, if you're an athlete, is decreased, or if your ability to kind of just get oxygen into your lungs, and when you're going on a run or exercise and you're doing any really physical activity, or if you know that your mental health has declined, for example, if you're experiencing symptoms of anxiety or depression when you try and stop using nicotine products, that's a very clear sign that nicotine has kind of woven its way into your brain's chemistry, right? Earlier, I mentioned your dopamine threshold being raised. Essentially, what this means is each and every one of us, we're kind of used to how we feel on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, we all have good days and bad days, and it's influenced by the activities we do, the people around us, what goes on in our day-to-day lives, sometimes just sheer randomness. But at the end of the day, if your brain is conditioned to believe that the baseline or the norm for how much dopamine is in your brain should be like this high instead of like what it normally would be at because of nicotine, then when you stop using it, essentially your brain feels like it's deprived of dopamine, it's deprived of being happy. And so that's kind of just a sign that, your brain's chemistry has fundamentally been altered by this psychoactive drug. Foregoing social activities, for example, if you wanted to hang out with your friends or you wanted to do something, but you know that either they're not comfortable with you smoking or really any other means of ingestion, or if it's because they're going to a venue or a place where you're not able to use nicotine products and you decide not to go, that's a very clear sign that you're putting your use of this substance in front of other things that you typically would be partaking in or would be enjoying. Finally, if you develop withdrawal symptoms or if you notice your tolerance being increased, Bennett mentioned tolerance in the last slide, but ultimately, if you're using more and more nicotine to get high or get that head rush or feel a buzz, then that's a very clear sign that your body is getting used to this chemical. You're needing more and more to have that same feeling, and that's a very clear sign that addiction is either, if it hasn't already set in, it's something that's on the horizon. Developing withdrawal symptoms, we'll go into that on the next slide, actually. So what exactly are nicotine withdrawal symptoms? Well, when you try and stop using really anything that's addictive, right? It can be a substance like nicotine, it can be alcohol, it can be something that isn't necessarily even an illegal or illicit substance. It could be playing video games if you're addicted to that. There's fundamentally a certain amount of withdrawal that you experience, when you stop doing it, because your brain has been conditioned to want to do this repeatedly. So in the case of nicotine, when you stop using it, there are a couple different symptoms, primarily broken into physical and psychological symptoms. Physical symptoms, an increased appetite often happens when people stop smoking, especially a hankering for sweets and other carbs. And this is because when you take nicotine, it actually suppresses certain chemicals in your brain that tell you when you're supposed to be hungry. This is why for decades it was seen as a way to remain thin or meet conventional beauty standards. But when you stop smoking, when you stop really any sort of form of nicotine ingestion, your brain is suddenly, it has that flood of chemicals telling you that you're hungry. So people oftentimes eat a lot when they stop smoking or when they try and stop smoking. In addition, you can develop a cough. For example, if you aren't a long-term smoker and you don't have a persistent cough from smoking yet, when you quit using nicotine products, you can develop a cough because it's essentially your lungs trying to clear themselves out. There's been a lot of mucus, there's been damage to the various structures within your lungs that help you breathe and help you take in oxygen. And when you stop smoking or when you stop using nicotine products, your lungs are essentially trying to clean themselves out, repair themselves so that they can be back in tip-top shape. And because of that, people often develop a cough. Headaches happen. Once again, your brain is being deprived of a chemical that it's become dependent on. And so a lot of people complain of headaches, retention headaches. In addition to that, you can be dizzy or experience fatigue. These are both related, once again, just to the fact that you don't have the same amount of adrenaline and dopamine in your systems. And so because of this, your body and brain just really are feeling off, right? In the same way that if you started taking a new substance, you might experience various symptoms. When you stop taking one that your body's become conditioned to, fundamentally various aspects of your body have been changed and need to return to equilibrium. Constipation can also occur because nicotine, oddly enough, can impact various systems of your body that aren't even related to necessarily your method of ingestion. And part of that can be your digestive tract. So when you stop using nicotine, some users become constipated afterwards. And finally, insomnia, because your brain doesn't have the same chemical balance that it's been having for however many weeks, months, or years that you've been using nicotine. Some people oftentimes find it hard to sleep or hard to get rest because there's a lot of restlessness just going on because of the chemical imbalance, but also because of the psychological symptoms, which we'll get into in a little bit. So looking at the psychological symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety and depression are oftentimes both very common. I already touched on this earlier, but when your dopamine threshold has been raised to a certain point and you do something to try and bring it back down for a period of time, you will essentially feel low. And this can lead to feelings of anxiety or depression. And for people who are predisposed to anxiety or depression or various other psychological or behavioral conditions related to that, it can oftentimes be a lot worse because this can just exacerbate those underlying or existing conditions. In addition, irritability and frustration are oftentimes very common because once again, you're just really not feeling yourself, right? For a long time, you've conditioned your brain and body to believe that a normal state of being is one where you have nicotine in your blood and nicotine in your brain. And when you don't have that going on, it's essentially just, you're not feeling as great. So you're much more liable to snap at people or just really not be in the right mood to interact with others. Restlessness is often common. This is related to insomnia. Once again, you're just not feeling yourself. So as your brain chemistry is sort of returning to equilibrium or returning to normal, it oftentimes leads to feelings of restlessness or just anxiousness, general antsy behavior. Difficulty concentrating. This is oftentimes because, once again, nicotine is a stimulant. It promotes your brain to focus and feel energized. You have adrenaline and dopamine, which both are chemicals that make your brain want to hone in on whatever it is you're doing. Because in nature, these are chemicals that influence our brains and body's abilities to be able to perform and act in the wild. When we're deprived of these levels of adrenaline and dopamine that we're used to, we essentially find it difficult to concentrate, right? We're returning once again to that chemical equilibrium, and it's not something that we're used to. And finally, and most notoriously of all, there are nicotine cravings. So as we mentioned earlier, nicotine is a highly addictive substance. And as such, when you try and stop using it, you can experience intense cravings, more so if you've been using it for a long time, use it very frequently, or use a lot of it. And so cravings are generally the worst in the first 2 weeks, especially days 3 to 5. And this is because by the 3rd day of quitting nicotine, it's been cleared out of your system entirely, right? And so your brain is essentially at the most nicotine deprived that it's been in however long it is since you started smoking or started ingesting nicotine other ways. And so because of this, you're at that point where you really want to use it. So for a lot of people, these cravings can be incredibly intense and incredibly overwhelming. And we'll get to really resources for how to deal with those in the next slide. But one of the important things to remember is, firstly, after the first 2 weeks, most, if not all, of the physical and psychological symptoms will have abated. Cravings can still continue for weeks or months or even years afterwards, but they get progressively better over time. And in addition to that, after the first 2 weeks, episodes of cravings or episodes of wanting nicotine generally reduce themselves to about 15 minutes in length. It can vary from person to person, but for the average smoker, for the average person who uses nicotine, it oftentimes only lasts for about 15 minutes of that intense period of longing. Obviously, there may still be that underlying desire to smoke, but the actual craving that people associate with nicotine is much more likely to abate or go away after about 15 minutes. So a lot of it is really about kind of playing that mental game, so to speak. That's something that a lot of people refer to it as, because at the end of the day, it's an incredibly addictive substance, and changing your brain's chemistry or really returning it to normal isn't an easy task to do. And it takes not only a lot of willpower, but really a lot of support and help and resources from the people and systems around you. And so we'll be getting into that right now. Bennett, do you want to talk on this? Alrighty, it looks like Bennett has also left or been kicked, so I'll just kind of go over addiction support and treatment. So nicotine addiction, as we've mentioned multiple times, is really difficult to quit, or really difficult to kick, because once again, it's a substance that fundamentally alters your brain, but not only that, it's something that's incredibly widespread in society, right? I'm sure all of us, or at least almost all of us, know someone who has used or uses nicotine. And so it's incredibly widespread and incredibly prevalent. It's not stigmatized or frowned upon like many other drugs. And as such, people find a lot of spaces where they're able to use it, and it's very convenient and accessible. So because of that, a lot of people become addicted, and it's incredibly difficult for them to quit. However, resources and support systems from the people around you and from various support networks are there, and they're incredibly helpful. And for a lot of people who have quit smoking or who have tried to quit smoking, or really, again, any other form of nicotine ingestion, these support systems are incredibly beneficial. So one of the first examples of how to start quitting nicotine usage is behavioral therapy. So behavioral therapy is one of the universal first steps, as it's called, because it's recommended that everyone does it, because it's pretty ubiquitously beneficial. It's not necessarily a guarantee that you'll be able to quit like 100%, but it's incredibly beneficial to almost everybody who tries it. So for nicotine addicts, it's sometimes the only necessary measure to quit, although that's not always the case. And so combinations of counseling, therapy, and really being in spaces where they give you support, where they're able to help you through cravings and basically talk you through the fact that after the first few weeks, it gets significantly easier, have shown higher rates of success. So what you can see here, and we have another slide on resources that we'll copy and paste into the description for the YouTube video, is that the SAMHSA's National Helpline, or 1-800-662-HELP, is a confidential, free 24-hour helpline that allows you to get information and just allows you to kind of get that support and have someone that you're able to talk to, which really just gives you the opportunity to have someone be there for you. It's significantly easier to deal with addiction or really any other psychological or behavioral issue that you're struggling with when there's someone else there by you. So they don't offer counseling, but they are a really useful resource for connecting with those services and support. And because of that, a lot of people's first step is to turn to this helpline, because that way they're able to get in touch with people who are able to get help, people who are able to offer counseling and provide those services and support that are really needed to help quit nicotine addiction. In addition to that, another example of addiction support and treatment is nicotine replacement therapy. So it can be prescribed to minors. So if you are a middle school or high school or college student who's under the age of 21, which is the legal smoking age in the United States, but you are trying to quit nicotine addiction, you can get a prescription for nicotine replacement therapy. But if you're an adult who is legally able to buy nicotine products, then you're able to buy it over the counter. And so NRTs haven't been approved for use in children by the FDA, but you would have to, talk to a medicinal professional who would be able to prescribe you this and who basically is more informed on substances and substance addiction. But if you get a prescription or if you're able to buy it over the counter, NRTs are essentially ways for you to wean yourself off of nicotine in a significantly safer way. So you can avoid nicotine withdrawal, or at least greatly lessen the symptoms when you quit. And it's not meant to necessarily be a nicotine alternative per se. So for example, on earlier slides of how you could like various forms of ingestion, we talked about nicotine nicotine patches and nicotine gum. Both of these are examples where, once again, if you don't use nicotine, it's never advisable to start using it. But if you do use it, as Bennett mentioned, over 90% of the harms come from smoking and come from the combustion of material and the inhalation of that combusted material. And so using a patch or using gum will provide nicotine into your bloodstream, provide it to your brain, and essentially help you wean yourself off of it without all of those other harms that are attached to methods of ingestion like smoking. And so what you're oftentimes able to do with nicotine replacement therapy is start at a certain level and slowly and gradually take yourself off of it. Once again, it's not 100% successful. Really, at the end of the day, no solution to anything is. But nicotine replacement therapy combined with behavioral therapy are ways where you can really address these problems and where you're able to have a much higher rate of success because you have other systems and other people who are there helping you out and essentially getting you off of these, getting you off of this substance. And so here we have a bunch of additional resources. If anyone in the Zoom would like it, I can copy paste them into the chat, or I will put them into the description for the YouTube video. But at this point, we have about 7 minutes left in the Zoom, and I just wanted to open it up to questioning if anyone has any questions, anyone has any comments or concerns. Okie dokie. I will take that as a no. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. And if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching it. We really appreciate you guys just coming out and being here to support us and informing yourselves and hopefully spreading this information to others, right? At the end of the day, our purpose is to help educate people, especially younger generations, middle schoolers and high schoolers most of all, because a lot of our health systems and a lot of our health curricula isn't really all that educational, because at the end of the day, it promotes this idea of abstinence only or just say no policies, which don't really inform you of A, what the real dangers of these substances are, and B, how you can mitigate those harms, and if you are addicted to, or if you or your friends are using these products, how you can be essentially the safest you can or help get yourselves off of it. So thank you so much for coming to educate yourselves and hopefully your peers, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.